It is said that history is a tapestry woven from the threads of inevitable tragedies. We are but insects crawling across the loom, blinded by the flickering light of a dying sun. For 10,000 years, mankind survived on a diet of hate and the cooling embers of a golden age, a species defined not by its hope, but by its refusal to blink in the face of the encroaching dark. But the warp is a sea of infinite madness, and occasionally it vomits forth an anomaly, not a demon nor a xenos scourge, but a soul forged in a different crucible, a soldier of forgotten creed, bearing the sigil of a red and white stripe upon a blackened plate of unknown alloy. He does not kneel to the golden throne, yet he commands the stars. He does not fear the xenos, for he has rallied them. Into the guttering light of the Indomitus Crusade steps a phantom, a commander of a lost age, forced to lead an empire that has forgotten the meaning of choice. Logos 7 Alpha is engaged. Let us witness the convergence of two destinies. The Gidram province had long been a graveyard of ambition, a silent expanse of the segmentum pacificus, where the light of the astronomicon flickered like a guttering candle in a gale. Here, the vacuum was not merely empty. It was heavy with the psychic residue of 10,000 years of suffering. On the bridge of the Omnisia's logic, Muggos Logis Vane monitored the rhythmic pulse of the ship's cogitators, his own consciousness interfaced directly with the vessel's spirit. Suddenly, a rupture, not a warp, but a reality itself, shuddered through the sensors. It was a dark space event, a pinprick of absolute silence that defied the cacophony of the Empyrean. Out of this impossible needle-hole in the fabric of the universe tumbled a craft of blasphemous geometry. It bore no Geller field, no Gothic arches, and no prayer-etched hull plates. It was a sleek, curved predator of a ship, charcoal gray, and bearing the strange designation SSV Normandy. It drifted like a ghost, cold and silent, its very existence an affront to the Lex Imperialis and the sacred designs of the cult Mechanicus. Vane's optical mechadendrites whirred in a frenzy of data capture. This was no mere Xenos debris, but a vessel from a timeline that shouldn't exist, leaking a chronal radiation that tasted of ozone and ancient, forgotten stars. The recovery was a ritual of cold metal and whispered binary. Beneath the smog-choked, ochre skies of the Forge World Griffin 4, the alien craft was hauled into a restricted hangar by massive, clawed tractor arrays. The air in the hangar was thick with the scent of sacred unguents and the acrid smoke of incense burners, meant to ward off any scrap code or machine demons that might dwell within the smooth hull. As the hull was breached by laser cutters, the Mechanicus recovery teams, flanked by the hulking, brass-bound forms of Thalic's cohorts, moved with a mixture of reverence and clinical fear. Inside, they found no horrors of the warp, but a layout of haunting efficiency. At the heart of the ship sat a single stasis pod, its power levels critical but holding. The man inside was clad in a suit of N7 hardsuit armor, a design that lacked the bulky protection of ceramite but possessed a sleek, technological sophistication that made the tech priest's logic circuits itch with envy. The Muggos felt a tremor in his Vox grill. This was the anomaly, a relic of a human past, or a human future, wrapped in a stasis field that predated the Imperium itself. The command was given: initiate the awakening protocol, for the Omnisia demands the truth behind the phantom. Waking from stasis in the 41st millennium is not a gentle return to consciousness. It is a violent collision with a nightmare. As the life support hummed with the screech of dying capacitors, Commander Shepard's eyes snapped open, his pupils dilating as they met the harsh, red-spectrum glare of Mechanicus' chirurgeon vault. His first gasp was not of clean, filtered air, but an atmosphere heavy with the stench of recycled waste, stale incense, and the copper tang of blood. The figures leaning over him were not the familiar faces of his crew, but terrifying amalgams of flesh and rusted iron. Servo skulls drifted overhead, their empty sockets glowing with a baleful crimson light as they recorded his vitals. He tried to reach for his M6 Carnifex pistol, but his limbs were leaden, restrained by heavy magnetic shackles that hummed with a low-frequency suppression field. A chorus of binary cant filled the room, a digital shriek that felt like needles in his mind. Shepard looked past the clicking mechanical limbs of the Medicae servitors to see the gargantuan, Gothic architecture of a cathedral-like laboratory. This was not the Citadel. This was not the Alliance. This was a hell forged in the name of a god he did not know, and for the first time in his life, The commander felt the cold finger of true existential dread. The interrogation was a symphony of agony and confusion conducted by the Ordo Xenos. Inquisitor Valeria sat in the shadows of the interrogation sanctum, her face a mask of porcelain perfection, hiding a soul of tempered steel. For 72 hours, Shepard was subjected to the truth-seeker's litany, a grueling combination of psycho-indoctrination and neural scouring. They asked him of the Reapers, and when he described them, the Inquisitor's eyes narrowed. They sounded like a twisted echo of the Necrons, yet different, more organic in their malevolence. When he spoke of the Council and the Citadel, the room grew cold with the threat of execution. To cooperate with Xenos was the ultimate heresy, a crime punishable by total erasure. Yet, the psychers stationed behind the shadows trembled. They could not find the taint of chaos in his mind. His soul was firm, tempered by a different kind of fire, a Paragon or Renegade spirit that was alien to the warp-saturated galaxy. Shepard stared back at Valeria, his voice raspy but unbroken, explaining tactical maneuvers that bypassed the cumbersome logic of the Imperial Guard. He was a master of a war they had forgotten how to fight, a war of precision, of morale, and of impossible choices. As the interrogation concluded, the weight of Shepard's situation settled over him like a shroud. He was a man out of time, a ghost in a galaxy that worshipped its own decay. From his high-arched window in the holding cell, he watched the endless processions of zealots and the titanic silhouettes of warlord titans being blessed by thousands of chanting priests. The sheer scale of the Imperium's fanaticism was a suffocating blanket. He saw the servitors, unfortunate souls lobotomized into living tools, and felt a revulsion that eclipsed even his hatred for the husks. Yet, news of the anomaly had reached the highest levels of the Senatorum Imperialis. The Great Rift had torn the galaxy in two, and Robot Guilliman, the avenging sun, was desperate for leaders who would think outside the stifling dogmas of the Adeptus Terra. Shepard realized he was no longer a soldier of the Alliance, but piece on a much larger, much deadlier chessboard. He closed his eyes, the image of the Normandy's destruction still fresh in his mind, and began to plan. If this empire was the last hope for humanity, he would have to lead it or watch it burn. The commander was back in the fight, but the rules had changed, and the stakes were now the soul of a species. The sanctum of the Macrid's honor was not a room, but a cathedral of statecraft, an echoing vault where the very air fell heavy with the weight of 10,000 years of sorrow. Commander Shepard walked between rows of silent victors' guard, his own footfalls sounding like sacrilege against the polished marble floor. He was no longer in his battered N7 hardsuit. He had been clad in a tunic of heavy, dark wool, though he refused to relinquish the Omni-tool that hummed with a faint, defiant orange glow on his forearm. At the far end of the hall, seated upon a throne that seemed carved from the very foundations of order, was Robot Guilliman. The pre-march was a titan of gold and blue, a demigod whose presence exerted a physical pressure on the room. As Shepard approached, he felt the instinctual urge to reach for a weapon he didn't have. Not out of malice, but because everything in his soldier's soul told him he was standing before a force of nature. Guilliman's eyes, ancient and weary beyond measure, tracked the commander with a clinical intensity, searching for the anomaly that the Muggos had reported. The silence lasted an eternity, broken only by the rhythmic, mechanical breathing of the life support systems integrated into Primarch's armor of fate. You speak of a galaxy where humanity flourished through cooperation, yet you stand in a graveyard of your own making, Guilliman began, his voice a low thunder that vibrated in Shepard's chest. The pre-march had spent hours reviewing the data slates recovered from the Normandy, deciphering the records of the Citadel, the Reaper War, and the tactical philosophies of man who believed in the strength of diversity. To Shepard, the pre-march was a contradiction, a man of supreme logic leading a civilization of screaming fanatics. The commander stood his ground, his posture rigid, refusing to bow. He spoke not of gods or emperors, but of the logistics of survival. He challenged the pre-march on the inefficiency of the imperial tides, the waste of human life in the meat grinder of the Astra Militarum, and the stagnation of military that feared innovation. The surrounding ultramarines shifted, their hands tightening on bolter grips at the perceived insolence, but Guilliman raised a gauntlet hand, silencing them. He saw in Shepard a reflection of the pre-heresy world, a ghost of the imperial truth that had been smothered by the ecclesiarchy's incense. The tension in the room escalated when Shepard dared to mention the xenos. He spoke of the Turians, the Solarians, and the Krogan, allies who had bled alongside humanity to stop a greater threat. The air in the sanctum turned frigid. In the 41st millennium, such talk was the swiftest path to the pyre. But Shepard did not flinch. He drew a parallel between the Reapers and the encroaching Tyranid hive fleets, arguing that a galaxy divided by hate would inevitably be consumed by the Great Devourer. Guilliman's expression remained a mask of tempered iron, but internally, the avenging sun was calculating. He knew the Indomitus Crusade was faltering under the sheer weight of the Chaos uprising and the Necron resurgence. He needed a commander who could operate outside the rigid, often suicidal, dogmas of the Codex Astartes. He needed someone who could look at a battlefield not as a place of martyrdom, but as a puzzle to be solved with surgical precision. The Pre-March recognized that Shepard possessed a rare tactical genius, a quality that the Emperor had once prized above all else, now lost to the fog of superstition. As the debate raged, the specter of Shepard's past began to merge with the grim reality of his present. He realized that Guilliman was not just a leader, but a prisoner of his own empire, a rational man chained to a corpse god's throne. Shepard's Paragon instincts urged him to offer a hand, to find a way to bridge the gap between the secular past and this dark, theological future. He proposed a trial, gave him a detachment of the Unnumbered Sons, the Grey Shields who had no chapter call home, and let him prove that his methods of squad-based cohesion and combined arms maneuvers could achieve victories that the Imperial Hammer could not. Guilliman leaned forward, the light of the halo fields behind his throne casting a long shadow over the commander. The risk was immense. If Shepard failed, it would be seen as the Primarch's own heresy. If he succeeded, he might just provide the spark of ingenuity needed to prevent the total collapse of the Segmentum Solar. The meeting concluded not with an embrace, but with a cold, mutual understanding. Guilliman rose from his throne, towering over the commander like a statue brought to life. He did not grant Shepard a title of nobility or a rank in the ecclesiarchy. Instead, he handed him a data crystal containing the operational mandates for a splitter fleet of the Indomitus Crusade. "You are Phantom, Commander," Guilliman stated, his voice devoid of warmth but filled with a grim respect. "In this age, hope is a lie we tell the weak. But if you can bring victory where there is only slaughter, I will tolerate your presence. Go, lead these men. Teach them how to survive in a galaxy that wants only to eat their souls." Shepard took the crystal, his mind already racing with the logistics of troop movements and supply lines. He walked out of the sanctum, the Victrix guard parting before him, and for the first time since his awakening, the commander felt a familiar weight on his shoulders. The mission had changed, the scale was now universal, but the objective remained the same: save humanity, no matter the cost. The muster fields of the moon of Lapis were a sprawling landscape of industrial-scale militarization, a gray wasteland transformed into a staging ground for the Unnumbered Sons. Thousands of Primaris Grey Shields, their armor bearing the gray chevron of the Unaligned, stood in perfect, silent ranks that stretched toward the horizon. Overhead, the sky was choked by the massive, bulbous shapes of heavy lifters and the screaming engines of Stormhawk interceptors, their exhaust trails weaving a web of soot across the pale sun. Commander Shepard stood upon a raised observation platform, his new command staff, a mix of skeptical ultramarines, grim-faced Cadian officers, and tech priests, watching him with the predatory stillness of wolves. He felt the weight of the galaxy's scrutiny. He was an outsider, a relic, tasked with wielding a hammer he had not forged. The air was thick with the scent of promethium, the ozone of power shields, and the rhythmic, low-frequency hum of thousands of power packs idling in unison. This was not the sleek, professional military of the Systems Alliance. This was a holy crusade, a tide of steel and zealotry that moved with the momentum of a falling mountain. To bridge the gap between his tactical doctrine and the Astartes' culture of martyrdom, Shepard began with the Sergeant Cadre. Among them was Sergeant Carden of the Ultramarines, a veteran whose service studs gleamed with the light of a century of war. In a command tent illuminated by the flickering blue light of a hololithic tactical table, Shepard did not speak of glory or the Emperor's will. He spoke of force multipliers and squad-level initiative. He dismantled the traditional Imperial approach to the frontal assault, replacing it with the fire and maneuver tactics of his own era. He demonstrated how a squad of intercessors, supported by the pinpoint suppression of Reavers and the long-range elimination of Eliminators, could dismantle a superior force with minimal casualties. Carden watched the holographic projections with a stoic, unreadable expression, his hand resting on the hilt of a combat blade that had tasted the blood of a dozen worlds. The friction was palpable. To the Astartes, retreat was a sin, and caution was often viewed as cowardice. Shepard had to prove that his suicide mission mentality wasn't about seeking death, but about finding the 1% chance of victory and seizing it with both hands. The integration of the Imperial Guard, the Astra Militarum, presented a different challenge. While the Space Marines were the scalpel and the hammer, the millions of mortal soldiers were the blood and bone of the Crusade. Shepard walked to the trenches of the 101st Cadian Hellwalkers, seeing the exhaustion in their eyes and the grime beneath their fingernails. These were not the super soldiers of the Primaris Project. They were men and women held together by faith and the threat of the Commissar's bolt pistol. Shepard did the unthinkable for an Imperial High Commander. He ate in their mess halls, inspected their lost guns personally, and spoke to them not as subjects, but as soldiers. He ordered the logistics priest to prioritize medical supplies and high-quality rations over the distribution of religious icons, a move that nearly caused a mutiny among the ecclesiarchy observers. Yet, the morale of the rank-and-file surged. For the first time in their lives, they felt they were being led by a man who valued their lives as much as their deaths, a leader who viewed them as a resource to be preserved rather than ammunition to be spent. The fleet itself was a microcosm of the Imperium's fractured nature. Shepard's flagship, the Invictus, was a strike cruiser of ancient lineage, its halls filled with the chanting of servitors and the smell of drying parchment. To Shepard, the ship felt like a flying cathedral, inefficient and needlessly ornate. He spent weeks in the Strategium, working with the ship's navigator and the master of ordnance to recalibrate the targeting arrays and the Vox channels. He implemented combat information centers modeled after the Normandy's bridge, much to the chagrin of the traditionalist bridge officers who preferred to rely on the will of the ship's spirit. The commander found himself constantly battling the pervasive superstition that governed every aspect of Imperial technology. Every time a plasma drive was ignited, it required a ritual of oil and prayer. Every time a long-range scan was initiated, it required the sacrifice of a minor psycher's sanity. Shepard's patience was tested daily, but he navigated the political minefield with the same diplomatic grace he once used to unite the disparate races of the Council, slowly turning the Invictus into a vessel of precision in a navy of blunt force. The final muster was punctuated by a display of Shepard's own anomaly, his awakening biotics. During a live-fire exercise, a malfunctioning Redemptor dreadnought went on a rampage, its logic circuits fried by a scrap code leak. As the metallic Titan leveled its heavy onslaught Gatling cannon at a squad of terrified recruits, Shepard didn't call for a heavy weapons team. He moved. A flare of brilliant, blue energy erupted from his hands, a biotic barrier manifesting with a thunderous crack that deflected the incoming hail of fire. The Astartes froze, their hands instinctively moving to their weapons as they sensed a warp energy. But it wasn't the warp, it was something cleaner, more focused. Shepard closed the distance, his movement a blur of augmented speed, and used a concentrated warp blast, a throw, to knock the multi-ton dreadnought off its feet long enough for the tech priest to initiate a shutdown code. He stood in the settling dust, the blue glow fading from his eyes, as thousands of soldiers watched in stunned silence. They didn't know if he was a saint, a psyker, or a demon, but in that moment, the first muster was truly complete. Commander Shepard had not just gathered an army, he had earned their fear and with it, their absolute, terrifying loyalty. The silence of the Pariah Nexus was not the absence of sound, but the absence of the soul. As Shepard's fleet crossed the invisible threshold into Nephilim sector, the warp light of the Astronomicon vanished, replaced by a suffocating, emerald-tinged gloom that seemed to drain the very color from the bulkheads. On the bridge of the Invictus, the usual cacophony of chanting servitors and vox static fell into a rhythmic, terrifying hush. Navigators screamed in their sanctums as their third eyes saw only a flat, gray void where the tides of the Empyrean should be. Shepard stood at the center of the CIC, his Omni tool pulsing a steady, defiant orange against the creeping green shadows. He felt a phantom ache in his mind, a cold pressure that reminded him of the Reaper's indoctrination signals. Yet this was more absolute, a static field designed to still the vibration of life itself. The crew moved like sleepwalkers, their movements sluggish, their faith replaced by a hollow, gnawing dread. "Steady," Shepard commanded, his voice amplified by the voxcasters, sounding unerringly clear in the dampening field. He knew this atmosphere. It was the breath of the machine, the cold logic of an ancient predator that viewed organic life as a fleeting, messy error to be corrected. The first contact was not a broadside of cannons, but a surgical erasure of reality. A flotilla of Necron Shroud-class light cruisers phase into existence around the fleet's perimeter, their hulls composed of living metal that shimmered like oily silk. Unlike the chaotic, roaring battles Shepard had fought against the Geth or the Reapers, this was a silent ballet of destruction. The Necrons fired beams of focused emerald light, Gauss flares on a ship-to-ship scale, that did not explode upon impact but stripped the Invictus's outer hull away molecule by molecule. Shepard watched on the tactical holomap as two escort frigates simply evaporated, their crews reduced to atomic dust before they could even utter a prayer to the Emperor. Full power to the forward kinetic barriers. "Aim for their drive spines," he roared. But the bridge officers hesitated, their minds clouded by the stilling. Frustrated, Shepard shoved the day's rating aside and slaved the weapons array to his own Omni tool. He didn't use a standard Imperial broadside and prey tactic. He used a calibrated, sequential firing pattern that targeted the Necron ship's phase reactors. The Invictus's macro cannons roared, the shells guided by Shepard's pinpoint calculations, catching a Shroud cruiser as it attempted to phase out. The resulting explosion was a brief, violent flash of green fire that illuminated the void like a dying star. As the Void War raged, the internal politics of Crusade reached a boiling point. Inquisitor Greyfax, who had been shadowing Shepard's command since Lapis, strode onto the bridge, her power armor hissing with every step. She demanded that the fleet retreat and glass the nearby moons to prevent the xenos contagion from spreading, regardless of the millions of Imperial citizens still trapped in the mining colonies below. Shepard turned to face her, his eyes glowing with a faint, blue biotic flicker. "We don't win by burning our own people, Inquisitor," he snapped, his voice echoing with the authority of a man who had stood before the Council and refused to blink. Greyfax's hand moved to her power sword, the air between them thick with the threat of execution. To her, Shepard's compassion was a weakness, a gateway to heresy. But to Shepard, the people below were the only thing that made the fight worth winning. He realized that the Imperium's greatest enemy wasn't just the Necrons, but its own willingness to sacrifice its soul for a tactical advantage. He ignored her order, instead signaling the caddy in 101st to prepare for a low-atmosphere drop. He was going down there, into the heart of the stilling, to save the colonists or die trying. The descent into the mining colony of Virtus Prime was a journey into a mechanical hell. Shepard led the drop in a modified Overlord gunship, flanked by Sergeant Carden and a hand-picked squad of Grey Shields. As they breached the clouds, they saw the pylons, colossal blackstone monoliths that reached into the sky like the fingers of a buried god, pulsing with that same sickly green energy. Below them, the Necron legions were advancing with terrifying, synchronized precision. They didn't run. They didn't take cover. They simply marched, their silver carapaces reflecting the emerald glow of their weaponry. Shepard jumped from the gunship before it even touched the ground, using a biotic slam to crush a squad of Necron immortals beneath him. The impact sent a shockwave of blue energy through the dust, momentarily disrupting the local null field. "Form a perimeter. Overlapping fire lanes," he commanded. The Space Marines, momentarily clear to the stilling by Shepard's biotic flare, fought with a renewed, desperate ferocity. They were no longer fighting for the Emperor's glory. They were fighting for the man who had brought them through the silence. The chapter reached its climax in the shadow of the central pylon. Shepard found himself face to face with a Necron overlord, a regal, skeletal figure draped in a cloak of shifting light, wielding a hyperphase glaive that hummed with the power to sever souls. The Overlord spoke in a tongue of clicking, ancient metal, but Shepard's Omni tool translated the intent. "You are an anomaly, a ghost of a primitive age. You do not belong in this cycle." Shepard didn't respond with words. He responded with biotic enhanced charge, his combat blade clashing against the xenos' glaive in a shower of white-hot sparks. The duel was a blur of silver and blue, a struggle between the cold permanence of the machine and the burning, fragile will of a soldier. Shepard realized that the Necrons weren't just another enemy. They were the ultimate conclusion of the path the Imperium was on, life stripped of feeling, existence without a soul. With a defiant roar, he detonated a biotic field at point-blank range, the blast shattering the Overlord's physical form and sending a feedback loop into the pylon itself. The green light flickered, and for a brief moment, the screams of the warp returned to the sector. Shepard stood amidst the scrap metal remains of his foe, gasping for air, knowing that he had won the battle but had truly entered the sights of the galaxy's most ancient masters. The war for Sol in the Philim sector was a cold affair of logic and metal, but as the Crusade transitioned toward the world of Gathalammer, the air grew thick with the cloying, sulphurous stench of the great enemy. This was no longer a war of geometry. It was a war to profane. Gathalammer, a world once defined by its towering cathedrals and its role as a beacon of faith, had become a festering wound on the galaxy's hide. As the Invictus punched through the atmospheric veil, Shepard looked out upon a world that had been transformed into a sprawling altar to the dark gods. The Word-Bearers, the original architect of the Great Heresy, had turned the planetary capital into a labyrinth of screaming stone and flayed skin. The sky was a bruised purple, torn by lightning that didn't thunder but whispered blasphemies into the ears of the dying. Shepard felt a deep, visceral revulsion that transcended his military training. This was a corruption that targeted the very essence of what it meant to be human. He checked the seal on his hard suit, the N7 logo now scarred and blackened, and looked at the grim faces of the Caddy and 101st and the Grey Shields. They weren't just going into a battle. They were descending into a localized hell. The initial drop was a chaotic descent through a storm of anti-aircraft fire that bled from the muzzles of cannons forged in the warp. Shepard's Overlord gunship took a direct hit to the port engine, the vessel bucking like a wounded beast as it spiraled toward the shattered remains of the Cathedral of St. Caspar, braced for impact. He roared over the Vox, his voice competing with the screech of metal and the rhythmic chanting of the Word-Bearers that seemed to broadcast from the very stones of the city. Upon landing, the ramp fell to reveal a nightmare. The streets were choked with chaos cultists, their bodies mutated into grotesque parodies of humanity, charging with suicidal fervor that reminded Shepard of the husks, but fueled by a dark, ecstatic joy. He led his squad into the ruins, utilizing the modern cover tactics he had drilled into them. Instead of the traditional Astartes march into the teeth of the enemy, the Grey Shields moved in fire teams, using smoke grenades and localized biotic pulses to disorient the hordes. Shepard was at the tip of the spear, his assault rifle barking in rhythmic bursts, each shot aimed with a clinical precision that carved a path through the sea of madness. As they reached the inner sanctum of the cathedral, the air became so thick with warp energy that it began to frost on Shepard's visor. Emerging from the shadows were the Word-Bearers themselves, monstrous, crimson-armored giants adorned with scrolls of human skin and blasphemous icons. Their leader, a dark apostle named Malakarth, stood atop a pile of slaughtered Cadians, his voice a rhythmic, subsonic growl that caused the very air to vibrate with malice. He didn't see Shepard as a threat, but as a curiosity, a false prophet from a forgotten age. But Shepard had faced Sovereign. He had stared into the eyes of the Harbinger, and he was not intimidated by a priest of shadows. He ordered his squad to focus fire on the Apostle's retinue, while he tapped into the surging biotic energy within his own frame. The ambient warp energy of Gathalammer acted like an accelerant. His biotic abilities flared with a terrifying, blue-white intensity that he had never experienced before. He wasn't just moving fast. He was warping the space around him, creating singularities that sucked the screaming cultists into crushing gravity wells before detonating them in flashes of indigo fire. The mid-tier fighting intensified as the Word-Bearer's Defiler, a massive, crab-like war machine infused with a bound demon, crashed through the cathedral walls. Its battle cannon roared, turning a squad of Cadians into a red mist. Shepard realized that conventional firepower wouldn't be enough to breach the demon engine's cursed armor. He signaled Sergeant Carden to provide a distraction with his heavy bolters while he scaled the debris-strewn pillars of the nave. Moving with fluid, biotic-enhanced grace, Shepard leaped onto the back of the iron beast. He could feel the demon inside the machine, a thrashing, hateful consciousness that tried to burn his mind. He plunged his Omni blade, now supercharged with biotic energy, into the Defiler's soul core. The machine let out a mechanical scream that tore at the sanity of everyone in the room. A massive biotic explosion erupted from the point of impact, a nova that shattered the Defiler's hull and sent a shockwave through the cathedral, collapsing the vaulted ceiling and burying dozens of word-bearers beneath tons of consecrated stone. In the aftermath of the explosion, the tide of the battle began to turn. The word-bearers, their ritual disrupted and their war machine destroyed, began a tactical withdrawal into the deeper catacombs. Shepard stood amidst the rubble, his armor cracked and his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked down at his hands. They were still trembling with the residue of the blue energy, but he also saw the blood of the men he couldn't save. The Cadians were weeping, some from pain, others from the sheer spiritual exhaustion of fighting the archenemy. Shepard walked among them, helping the wounded, his presence a stabilizing force in a world gone mad. He realized that on Gathalammer, victory wasn't just about taking ground. It was about holding on to one's humanity when the universe was screaming at you to let go. He looked up at the bruised sky, knowing that the word-bearers were far from defeated. This was just the beginning of a long, bloody siege, and the commander knew that to win this war, he would have to become something more than a soldier. He would have to become a symbol of defiance against the very gods themselves. The Indomitus Crusade was built upon the bedrock of suffer not the alien to live. Yet Shepard knew that a galaxy divided was a galaxy already conquered. As the fleet pushed deeper into the Nephilim sector, they encounter a webway gate shimmering like a bruised thumbprint against the void. From its depths emerged the Eldari, the Inari, slender, lethal, and ancient. While the Imperial bridge crew reflexively armed their torpedo banks, Shepard did something that caused Inquisitor Greyfax's blood to run cold. He opened a Vox channel and requested a parley. He recognized the Inari not as monsters, but as a species facing the same extinction-level threat he had once fought alongside the Quarians and Geth. He stood on the observation deck, watching the elegant, curved ships of the Eldari dance around the slab-sided bulk of the Invictus. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and ancient secrets. To Shepard, this was a xenos gambit, a desperate attempt to trade Imperial dogma for a chance at survival, knowing that if he failed, he would be remembered not as a hero, but as the ultimate traitor to the Golden Throne. The meeting took place on a neutral moon, a world of silver sand and crystalline spires. Shepard stepped off his shuttle alone, much to the horror of Sergeant Carden, who watched from the ramp with his finger on the trigger of his bolter. Waiting for him was Iraine, the emissary of Iniad, her presence an ethereal blend of grace and death. She did not speak in the blunt tones of the Imperium. She spoke in rills of fate and the whispering god. Shepard, however, was a man of action and results. He bypassed the flowery Eldari metaphors and laid out a tactical hololith of the Pariah Nexus. He showed her the Necron pylon network, explaining how it was suffocating both their races, stifling the Eldari's connection to their spirit stones and the humans' connection to the warp. He proposed a joint strike. The Imperial fleet will provide the anvil of heavy firepower to draw the Necrons' attention, while the Inari acted as a hammer, utilizing the webway to strike directly at the heart of the central pylon complex. Iraine's obsidian eyes narrowed. She had lived for millennia and had never met a Monkey who spoke of synergy and shared objectives instead of holy fire. The diplomacy was interrupted by the sudden arrival of an Ordo Xenos strike team led by Inquisitor Greyfax herself. She descended from the clouds like a vengeful angel, her power armor's jump packs screaming. "Heresy!" she cried, her voice amplified by her suit's voxcasters to a deafening roar. To bargain with the Xenos is to forfeit your soul, Shepard. The crystalline spires around them shattered as the Inquisitors opened fire, not at the Eldari, but at Shepard for his perceived betrayal. The situation spiraled into a three-way standoff of terrifying proportions. Shepard was forced to use his biotics not to kill, but to shield, dropping a massive stasis field between the Inquisitorial stormtroopers and the Eldari Guardians. He stood in the center of the crossfire, his blue energy flares clashing against the red tracers of bolter rounds. He yelled at Greyfax, challenging her to look at the sky, where the Necron fleet was already closing in, drawn by the psychic turbulence of the conflict. He made her realize that if they killed each other now, the Necrons would finish the job before the sun set. The tension broke only when a Necron Knight's size shrieked overhead, its green Gauss beams carving a canyon into the silver sand. Faced with immediate annihilation, a bitter, fragile truce was forged in the heat of combat. Shepard led the combined force in a desperate defensive action, his N7 armor moving in a synchronized blur with the Eldari howling banshees. It was a sight that would have driven a traditionalist chaplain to madness. Space Marines of the Grey Shields providing cover fire for live Eldari warriors, while Shepard used a biotic charge to smash through a phalanx of Necron Lich Guard that had teleported onto the moon's surface. The Eldari moved like liquid silk, their power blades severing mechanical limbs with effortless grace, while Marines provided the raw, blunt trauma needed to shatter the Necron self-repair protocols. Shepard found himself fighting back-to-back with Iraine, his Omni blade and her crone sword weaving a tapestry of blue and purple destruction. By the time the last Necron construct was reduced to sparking scrap, the moon's surface was a graveyard of silver metal and crystal shards. Greyfax stood amidst the carnage, her armor scorched, looking at Shepard with a mixture of loathing and a new, dangerous respect. The alliance was unofficial, whispered, and highly illegal, but it had worked. Iraine vanished back into the webway with a final cryptic warning. The Necron's Silent King was awakening, and he would not be so easily distracted again. Shepard watched the shimmering portal close, knowing he had just placed a target on his back larger than any he had carried in his own galaxy. He had proven that cooperation was possible in the 41st Millennium, but he also realized the cost. As he returned to the Invictus, he saw the heretic graffiti already being scrawled on the lower decks. The commander was no longer just leading a crusade. He was inciting a revolution of thought, and an imperium of man. That was a crime far worse than death. The void of the Segmentum Pacificus screamed as the Invictus was violently jerked from its translation path, caught in the gravitational anchor of a World Eater's slaughter-class cruiser. This was not the measured cold warfare of the Necrons, nor the deceptive whispers of the word-bearers. This was a collision of raw, unadulterated madness. On the bridge, the air was suddenly filled with the discordant roar of chain axes and the metallic scent of spilled blood before the first boarding pod even struck. Shepard stood at the center of the command deck as the hull buckled and tore, 3 massive Dreadclaw pods slamming to the reinforced adamantium plating. From their iron maws erupted the butchers of Khorne, monstrous warriors in gore-slick red armor, their voices a cacophony of blood for the blood god. That short-circuited the sanity of the bridge ratings. Shepard didn't retreat. He drew his M96 Matic pattern rifle, a weapon he had modified with Imperial tech mats to fire explosive bolts, and leveled it at the lead berserker. The commander's face was a mask of cold resolve. He had fought the Krogan in their blood rage, but even they lacked the mindless, metaphysical hate of these transhuman slaughterers. The fighting on the bridge was a claustrophobic nightmare of flying ceramite and severed limbs. Shepard moved with fluidity that mocked the heavy, lumbering strikes of the World Eaters. He used his biotics not as a shield, but as a kinetic hammer, utilizing a biotic charge to close the gap between him and a chain-axe-wielding giant. The impact was a thunderclap of blue energy that shattered the berserker's breastplate and sent him flying through a bank of Vox stations. Shepard followed the strike with a point-blank Nova detonation, the indigo shockwave clearing a circle of breathing room amidst the red tide. He realized quickly that these enemies could not be reasoned with or suppressed. They had to be dismantled. He began to go Renegade out of sheer tactical necessity, using the environment as a weapon. He overrode the bridge's gravity plating, causing the localized weight to spike to 10 times the norm. The World Eaters, caught off guard by the sudden crushing force, stumbled, their heavy boots cracking the floor plating. In that moment of vulnerability, Shepard and his gray shields opened fire, their bolters and Mass Effect rounds turning the bridge into a meat grinder of red and blue sparks. As the boarding party was pushed back from the command deck, Shepard led a counterassault into the guts of the ship, the narrow, steam-filled corridors leading to the engine rooms. Here, the butcher's nails, the cybernetic implants in the World Eater's brains, seemed to resonate with the ship's own groaning spirit. The walls were decorated with the skulls of former crewmen, a grim testament to the fate awaiting the Invictus should Shepard fail. The commander found himself in a duel with a World Eater's champion, a beast of a man whose armor was fused with his flesh and whose chain glaive hummed with a thirsty, demonic intelligence. The champion moved with a speed that defied his size, his strikes carving deep gouges into the bulkheads. Shepard was forced to push his biotic limits, his veins glowing with a faint, subcutaneous blue light as he channeled the energy directly into his muscles. He dodged a decapitating swing, the teeth of the glaive inches from his throat, and countered with a pull that yanked the champion off balance. He then surged forward, his Omni blade extending in a blade of superheated orange light, and plunged it to the champion's throat, twisting the blade until the demon engine within the man died with a gurgling shriek. The carnage intensified as Shepard realized the World Eaters were not just boarding to kill, but to sabotage the plasma reactor. If the ship went critical, the entire Crusade fleet would be crippled in the blast. Shepard reached the reactor core just as a squad of Chaos Terminators began planting melta charges on the containment coils. The heat in the room was unbearable, the air shimmering with the radiation of the leaking core. Shepard ordered his squad to hold the entrance while he navigated the catwalks alone. He felt the warped taint of the room trying to claw at his mind, a red haze of anger threatening to overwhelm his logic. He fought it back with the memory of the Normandy, the memory of a crew that relied on him to be the anchor. He used a singularity to draw the Terminators away from the coils, the gravity while pulling their massive forms into the air like helpless beetles. As they hung suspended, he unleashed a concentrated warp blast that detonated the singularity, the resulting biotic explosion shearing through the Terminator's tactical dreadnought armor and sending them plummeting into the reactor's cooling vents. The victory was hollow and stained with the copper tang of total war. Shepard stood over the cooling reactor, his N7 armor scorched and his breathing coming in ragged, painful gulps. He looked at his hands. The blue biotic glow was flickering, fading into a dull, exhausted gray. He had saved the ship, but at a cost that felt heavier than any he had paid in his own timeline. The Invictus was a graveyard, its halls filled with the bodies of loyalist and traitor alike. He saw Sergeant Carden approaching, the Space Marine's armor covered in the blood of his brothers, his expression one of grim, silent acknowledgement. Shepard realized that in this universe, there was no Paragon path that led to a clean victory. To survive the 41st millennium, one had to embrace the iron in their soul and the blood on their hands. He looked into the flickering monitors of the engine room, seeing the reflection of a man he barely recognized, a commander who was becoming as cold and uncompromising as the galaxy he was trying to save. The iron and biotics had held, but the man within the armor was beginning to fracture under the weight of the endless slaughter. The void did not just darken, it curdled. As the Indomitus fleet transitioned toward the world of Orestes, the psychic scream of the shadow in the warp hit, like a physical blow, a static choked silence that drowned out the prayers of the faithful and the logic of the machine. Shepard stood on the observation deck of the Invictus, watching as the stars themselves were blotted out by a living carpet of chitin and meat. Hive Fleet Leviathan had arrived, millions of bioships, pulsating with a rhythmic, alien hunger, descended like a shroud over the sector. To Shepard, this was a horror that dwarfed even the Reaper invasion. Where the Reaper sought to harvest, the Tyranids sought only consume, leaving nothing but barren rocks in their wake. The commander felt the cold, psychic weight of the hive mind pressing against his biotic-sensitive brain, a singular, terrified that saw him not as a leader or an anomaly, but as a particularly stubborn protein. He turned to the command staff, his voice cracking the unnatural silence. "This isn't a siege," he stated, his eyes reflecting the bioluminescent glow of the approaching swarm. "It's a feeding frenzy, and we are the only thing that's going to make them choke." The planetary defense of Orestes became a masterclass in total planetary-scale mobilization. Shepard bypassed the traditional Imperial strategy of holding every inch of ground until death, which he viewed as a tactical suicide. Instead, he organized a deep strike defense, treating the entire hive world as a series of Normandy-scale kill zones. He integrated the Caddy and 101st with the Grey Shields, creating specialized vanguard squads designed to hunt the Tyranid synapse creatures, the hive tyrants and warriors that acted as the nervous system for the mindless swarms. As the first mycetic spores slammed into the city's spires like organic meteors, Shepard led the defense from the ground. The air was thick with the musk of alien spores and the acrid stench of Tyranid acid. He moved through the ruins of the lower hives, his biotic shockwave, sending ripples to the carpet of chittering hormagaunts, throwing their broken bodies into the air like dry leaves. He was a dervish of blue energy and lead, his every movement calculated to preserve his troops while inflicting maximum attrition on the endless tide of claws and teeth. The horror of the Great Devourer reached its zenith when a bio-titan, a hierophant of nightmarish proportions, breached the inner sanctum of the capital hive. It stood taller than the surrounding cathedrals, its multi-jointed limbs crushing tanks like insects, its bio-cannon spitting globs of living, soul-dissolving acid. Shepard realized that if the Hierophant reached the main generator hub, the planetary shields would fail, leaving millions to be consumed. He ordered a suicide mission strike, taking only Sergeant Cardin and a squad of veteran jump pack intercessors. They ascended the beast using its own massive, chitinous ridges as platforms. The wind howled to the Hierophant's ribcage as Shepard climbed, the creature's psychic roar vibrating in his marrow. He fought off swarms of gargoyles midair, his omni-blade carving through leathery wings while his biotics flared with desperate intensity. This was the Reaper War all over again, but the enemy was alive, breathing, and possessed a malice that was purely biological. At the summit of the beast, Shepard found the primary neural cluster, a pulsating mass of brain matter protected by thick plates of reinforced bone. As he prepared to plant a melt-a-charge, the shadow in the warp intensified, the hive mind focusing its singular gaze upon him. For a moment, Shepard's vision blurred. He saw the faces of the crew he had lost, the ghosts of Earth and Thesha, all merging into the endless, hungry eyes of the Tyranids. The alien will try to break him, to convince him that resistance was an evolutionary impossibility. But Shepard's Paragon resolve was a shield forged in a different universe. He roared defiance that echoed to the psychic void, his biotics erupting in a blinding nova that didn't just damage the flesh, but severed the synapse connection itself. The Hierophant stumbled, his titanic nervous system short-circuiting, and as the melted charge detonated, the beast collapsed in a mountain of burning meat and ichor, its death scream temporarily clearing the psychic fog over the city. The victory on Orestes was a Pyrrhic one. As the dust settled, Shepard stood atop the carcass of the Bio-Titan, looking out at a horizon filled with more spores, more bio-ships, and more hunger. The Tyranids were not defeated. They were merely delayed. He saw the toll the Shadow had taken on his men, Space Marines whose faith was shaken, and Cadians who had gone catatonic from the psychic pressure. Shepard himself was pale, his biotic veins standing out in stark, glowing relief against his skin, a sign of the immense strain he was under. He realized that the scale of this war was beyond anything a single man, or even a single legion, could win. He looked up at the sky, where the Invictus was still trading fire with bioships, and felt a cold, hard truth take root. To save this galaxy, he couldn't just be a commander. He had to be a spark that ignited a fire across the entire Imperium, even if that fire burned him to ash. The Shadow in the warp had shown him the end of all things, and for the first time, Commander Shepard felt the true, staggering weight of 1 billion lives resting on his shoulders. The summons to Holy Terror was not an invitation, but a gravitational pull that no soul in the galaxy could resist. As the Invictus entered the Sol system, the sheer, crushing weight of 10,000 years of fanaticism pressed against the hull. Shepard stood at the viewport, watching the throne world reveal itself. A planet-sized cathedral, encased in layers of orbital plates, weapon spires, and the endless, shimmering haze of the Emperor's psychic aegis. To the commander, it was a terrifying monument to a species that had traded its future for a gilded, stagnant past. He was escorted from the landing pad not by his loyal gray shields, but by a phalanx of Adeptus Custodes, golden giants whose silence was more intimidating than any roar of a world eater. They moved with a lethal, preternatural grace, their guardian spears humming with power. Shepard, his N7 armor polished, but still bearing the deep scars of Tyranid's claws, walked through the Eternity Gate. He felt the eyes of 1 trillion pilgrims upon him, a tide of humanity that viewed him as a saint, a savior, or the ultimate heretic to be purged from existence. The journey through the inner palace was a descent into a divine fever dream. The air was thick with the scent of ancient incense and the low, rhythmic thrum of the Golden Throne's machinery, a sound like the heartbeat of a dying star. Shepard was led into a hall of such vast proportions that its ceiling was hidden by clouds of burning holy oils. At the far end, beneath a halo of blinding, psychic light, stood Captain General Trajan Valoris and a panel of High Lords, their faces etched with the bitterness of those who had ruled a crumbling empire for too long. They did not see a hero of the Indomitus Crusade. They saw a dangerous variable that defied the ecclesiarchy, bargained with xenos, and wielded an anomaly of power that smelled of the warp. The trial began not with evidence, but with an accusation of spiritual corruption. They demanded to know the source of his blue fire and the logic of his cooperation with the alien. Shepard stood at the center of the hall, a lone soldier against the weight of a god state, his voice echoing off the adamantium vaults as he spoke of humanity that was meant to lead the stars, not worship its own decay. The tension reached a breaking point when a High Lord of the ecclesiarchy declared Shepard's soul forfeit to the pyre. In that moment, the temperature in the room plummeted, and the air grew heavy with a pressure that caused even the custodes to stiffen. The doors to the inner sanctum opened, and Robert Gilliman strode into the light. The Primarch did not look at the High Lords. He looked at Shepard. The Avenging Son's presence was a cold, refreshing logic amidst the stifling heat of the palace. He spoke not of faith, but of necessity. Gilliman presented the records of Orestes and Gathalammer, victories that the Imperium's traditional methods could never have achieved. He defended Shepard as a soul of old humanity, a relic of the era before the Emperor was a god and before the light of reason was extinguished. To execute the commander, Gilliman argued, would be to execute the very spark of ingenuity that the Imperium needed to survive the era Indomitus. It was a confrontation between the living son of a god and the stagnant bureaucracy of his father's corpse, with Shepard's life hanging in the balance of their shared, silent understanding. In a move that defied 10 millennia of tradition, Gilliman requested that Shepard be allowed to stand before the Golden Throne itself. The High Lords recoiled in horror, but Valoris, sensing a design beyond his own understanding, stepped aside. Shepard walked alone into the final chamber, the heat becoming an all-consuming fire that threatened to strip the flesh from his bones. There, amidst the titanic machinery of the throne, he saw the Emperor, a shattered, skeletal figure of light and shadow, held in a state of eternal agony to keep the galaxy from being swallowed by the warp. Shepard didn't see a god. He saw a leader who had made the ultimate sacrifice, a man who had become a machine to save a species that no longer understood his vision. The psychic pressure was a scream of a billion voices, a kaleidoscope of human history, suffering, and hope. In that blinding moment of communion, Shepard didn't receive a blessing. He received a burden. He saw the truth of the great work and the terrifying fragility of the thread, holding reality together. When Shepard emerged from the throne room, his eyes were no longer just blue. They sparkled with faint, golden resonance that flickered beneath the biotic surface. He was changed. He walked past the High Lord without a word, his silence carrying a weight that silenced even the most vocal of his accusers. The verdict was reached. Shepard would not be purged. Instead, he was granted the Mark of the Regent, a mandate that gave him unprecedented authority to lead a specialized, independent crusade, the Normandy Crusade. He was to be the scalpel of the Primarch, a force that operated outside the boundaries of the Lex Imperialis to strike at the heart of the galaxy's most existential threats. As he boarded his shuttle to leave Terra, Shepard looked back at the sprawling palace for the last time. He had survived the judgment of the gods, but he realized that the saint they wanted him to be was a lie. He was still just a soldier, but now he was a soldier who had seen the face of the end, and he knew exactly what he had to do to stop it. The Normandy Crusade was not merely a military campaign. It was a theoretical impossibility made manifest in an age of dogma. As Shepard's new fleet, a unified strike force of Grey Shields, Cadian veterans, and even a shadow contingent of Inari, translated into the void, the galaxy seemed to tremble at the arrival of a new paradigm. On the bridge of the newly rechristened Invictus Normandy, Shepard stood before a tactical holomap that spanned the entire Great Rift. He had been given a mandate that bypassed the stifling bureaucracy of the High Lords, and he used it to forge a weapon of surgical precision. He had implemented a systems alliance hierarchy within his fleet, where merit outweighed birthright and tactical flexibility superseded religious fervor. To the traditionalists of the Segmentum Solar, He was a dangerous radical, but to the millions of soldiers under his command, he was the first leader in 10 millennia who looked at them as humans rather than fuel for the Imperial machine. The air on the bridge no longer smelled of stagnant incense, but a sharp, clean ozone of high-tech efficiency and a renewed hope of crew that finally believed they could win. The climax of Crusade's first phase took place at the Gidrim Gate, a critical junction where the forces of the Necron Silent King and the Black Legion were converging to tear open a new wound in reality. Shepard orchestrated a battle that would be studied by the Ultramarines for generations. He utilized Mass Effect physics, calibrated through his modified Imperial tech, to create localized gravity wells that pulled Chaos cruisers into the path of Necron Gauss beams, forcing his enemies to destroy one another. He led the final boarding action himself, a combined arms strike that saw Space Marines and Eldari striking Scorpions fighting in a synchronized ballet of violence. Shepard was a blur of golden blue light, his biotics now infused with a fragment of the Emperor's own psychic resonance. He moved to the corridors of Abaddon's Vanguard flagship, his every strike a fusion of tactical perfection and divine fury. He wasn't just fighting for survival. He was rewriting the rules of engagement for the 41st millennium, proving that the unification he had once achieved in another life was the only path to salvation in this one. As the dust of the Gidrim victory settled, the theoretical conclusion of Shepard's journey began to take shape. He had become the commander of the crossing, a bridge between the ancient imperial truth and the grim reality of the present. He did not seek to overthrow the Emperor, nor did he seek to become a god himself. Instead, he acted as a catalyst for a soft reformation. Under his guidance, the Grey Shields began to adopt the N7 Creed, a philosophy of elite, small-unit excellence that emphasized the protection of the weak over the accumulation of glory. The Normandy Crusade became a beacon for the lost and the disillusioned, a place where a soldier's worth was measured by their courage and their capacity for mercy. Gilliman watched from Mackridge with a mixture of relief and trepidation. He had found his most effective general, but he had also introduced a variable that might eventually outgrow the Imperium itself. Shepard was a specter in every sense, a ghost of a better age, haunting a dying empire with the possibility of a future. The aftermath of Shepard's ascension was felt in the shifting tides of the warp. The shadow in the warp, cast by the Tyranids and the screaming madness of chaos, found a new, stubborn resistance in the collective willpower of the Normandy Crusade. Shepard's influence acted as a psychic anchor, a Paragon beacon that stabilized the souls of those who followed him. He had introduced the concept of choice back into a universe of predestination. On worlds saved by his fleet, the citizens did not just pray for deliverance. They organized, they innovated, and they fought with a clarity that had been missing since the Great Crusade. The commander had realized that the Reapers, the Necrons, and the demons were all symptoms of the same cosmic entropy. To fight them, one needed more than just bigger guns. One needed a reason to live that was stronger than the fear of death. Shepard provided that reason, turning a crusade of vengeance into a crusade of restoration. In the final, quiet moments aboard the Invictus Normandy, Shepard stood at the observation port, looking out at the glittering expanse of the galaxy he had been reborn to save. His armor was a patchwork of N7 plating and Imperial ceramite, a perfect metaphor for his dual existence. He knew the war would never truly end, that the 41st millennium was a cycle of eternal conflict. But as he watched the stars, he felt a familiar sense of resolve. He had united the Citadel, he had defeated the Reapers, and now he was a shepherd of a new humanity. The Warhammer Crossverse was no longer just a collision of two worlds. It was a new synthesis, a timeline where a single man had tilted the scales of fate. Shepard tapped his Omni tool, the orange glow reflecting in his eyes, which still held a spark of the Emperor's gold. "This is Commander Shepard," he whispered into the Vox, his voice carrying across the void to every ship in his fleet. "We have a galaxy to save. Let's get to work."